The late U. Gregory Gallagher, paralyzed by polio since age 19, wrote 2 books about people with disabilities, FDR's Splendid Deception and By Trust Betrayed, Patients, Physicians, and the License to Kill in the Third Reich. In the introduction to By Trust Betrayed, he wrote, quotes, "Before I had polio, I remember I was frightened by disabled people. They made me feel ill at ease, embarrassed. I would cross the street to avoid walking past a man in a wheelchair. Now I find myself in a wheelchair, and it feels quite ordinary. My friends do not seem to pay much attention to it one way or the other. Certainly, they are not repelled as I once was," end quotes. He goes on to say, quote, "Traditionally, or at least in recent centuries, Western society has thought of the disabled in the medical mode. They are seen as sick people who somehow never get well. This, of course, causes all sorts of difficulties in relations between the disabled and the medical community. What do you do with, quotes, refractory cases, as the German physicians of the 30s called those of us who refuse to respond to therapy?" End quote. Or as Gerhard Bader, a Holocaust survivor and medical historian, summed up succinctly the behavior of the German medical profession toward refractory cases during the Third Reich: "If you can't cure it, kill it." The lecture topic for tonight's distinguished panel, assembled by our last speaker, Professor Lex Frieden, is Disability and Genocide, Where Are We Today? I will introduce each panelist before they speak, beginning with Professor William Monroe, Professor of English and Executive Associate Dean of the Honors College at the University of Houston. His book, Power to Hurt, The Virtues of Alienation, was selected as an outstanding academic book of the year by Choice magazine for 1999 and nominated for Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award. His other publications include the play Primary Care, which deals with personhood issues related to Alzheimer's disease, and articles on T.S. Eliot, Vladimir Nabokov, and Willa Cather. He also has an interest in the scholarship of teaching and recently published an essay on the old school methods of Wayne Booth, his mentor at Chicago. Professor Monroe directs the Common Ground Teachers Institute and founded the Medicine and Society program at the University of Houston, and he is currently at work on The Vocation of Affliction, Flannery O'Connor, and Our Myths of Mastery. Bill teaches honors courses in literature and medicine and contemporary American fiction, and in 2004 at the University of Houston, the University of Houston awarded him its Teaching Excellence Award. He was an early supporter of this entire program and has attended all of the student sessions which take place there between 4 or 5, bringing many of his students from the University of Houston with him. Tonight, it's our pleasure to put him in front of the microphone so he can address you. His topic for tonight will be disability and the myth of mastery. Please join me in welcoming Professor William Monroe.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks to Pete and to Shelley. It has been my distinct pleasure to be in attendance at all of the lectures and special events this fall, and to have heard some of the leading bioethicists, philosophers, historians, and medical clinicians in the country. I feel humble to play a small part in this series, especially this evening, when I'm part of a panel that includes persons who know about disability firsthand. And so I also want to say a special thanks to Lex, to Jacquie, and to Richard for inviting me to join them this evening. It is on occasions such as these that I'm reminded of my friend Don Reed, who for several years dealt with life-threatening heart failure and bouts of pancreatitis associated with atherosclerosis and probably his frequent use of alcohol in his 20s and 30s. These episodes were excruciating, debilitating, and life-threatening in themselves, the pancreatitis, forcing Don into the hospital in a series of close calls. I asked him to come to our literature and medicine class at Houston and talk to us about his condition and his treatments, his experience of pain, and his awareness of death. He arrived, He arrived slightly ahead of schedule and listened attentively as I finished up my discussion of the book of Job with a short disquisition on redemptive suffering. Then I introduced Don. Don called me cowboy, as in, "How you doing, cowboy?" This form of address was very satisfying. It made me feel nomadic, slightly dangerous, and irresistible to women. In his mid-40s, by the time I met him, Don had drunk a lot of beer and kissed a lot of girls. He was a lifetime member of the Hold'em and Hit'em Club, a scholarship-giving organization associated with the Houston Rodeo, whose members at least pretended to live up to the name of their charitable organization. He had played football in college and was aggressive and successful in business before his heart problems put him on the disabled list for good. That's when he went back to school to get his degree and began working on a novel about a hard-boiled, hard-drinking detective based loosely on his own experiences as a fast-talking, skirt-chasing traveling salesman. The novel in progress was not half bad. Didn't hate it, as one of my colleagues likes to say about guilty pleasures. By the time Don visited our class, he had settled down, had a wife and a young daughter whom he adored, and a heart that was slowly but inexorably failing. We didn't realize it. Don was hale and hearty that evening, full of life as always, and hiding his discomfort despite the chronic pancreatic inflammation. But when he came as a guest speaker, he had only a few weeks left. It was about this time in the fall semester, late October. He was gone by Christmas. I have a tape somewhere of Don's remarks, but what I remember most clearly was his gentle chiding of my disquisition on suffering and how it could be redemptive. "That's a good one," he said, as if he had been let in on some kind of academic joke. Redemptive suffering. Yeah, I'm going to have to remember that one. Redemptive suffering. And he nodded to himself like he had heard a real howler. I recall this story tonight because, as Ronald Reagan might say, there you go again. What do I know, after all, about redemptive suffering, disability, and what I have the temerity to call the vocation of affliction? Perhaps if I admit that as one whom disability thus far has largely passed over, I have no right to speak of these things. You will permit me to offer some insights from those who perhaps do. My admittedly academic perspective on disability comes most directly from the life and work of the Southern comic writer Flannery O'Connor. O'Connor died of systemic lupus erythematosus in 1964 at the age of 39. She was moderately disabled much of her writing life, appeared at readings on crutches, and was in and out of hospitals in Atlanta and Milledgeville, where she lived almost literally in the shadow of a state hospital known as the world's largest insane asylum. In a 1956 letter to her new friend Betty Hester, she writes, "I have never been anywhere but sick. In a sense, sickness is a place, more instructive than a long trip to Europe. And it's always a place where there's no company, where nobody can follow." In 1960, a group of nuns contacted Flannery with an idea that she found painfully sentimental. They wanted her to write a novel about a little girl, Marianne Long, who had lived in a cancer hospice with them for about 7 years before she died at the age of 12. Flannery, and many if not most scholars have taken to calling her Flannery, not out of disrespect but out of fondness and in recognition of her distinctive self-given nom de plume. Flannery refused to write a novel about the child, but offered to help the nuns write their own memoir of Marianne, to edit it, help them place it with a publisher, and write a foreword or introduction. That introduction is, I believe, one of the great 20th century meditations on suffering, disfigurement, and disability. There she addresses some of the connections that are explored in the Holocaust Museum Houston's exhibit, Eugenics, Euthanasia, and Extermination, and considers questions that have come forth in the course of this lecture series. Early in her essay, Flannery recalls Nathaniel Hawthorne's story, The Birthmark, a rendering of an old tale that has much in common with the myth of Frankenstein, presented and discussed last week by Susan Lederer. Hawthorne's story, like Flannery's introduction, anthologized in Being Human, the stimulating collection edited by Leon Cass, describes another Dr. Frankenstein, another scientist seeking to engineer humanity, to overcome limitations, to achieve perfection. We shouldn't be surprised when scientists seek perfection. It's in the nature of their work. It's what they do. If the social theorist Kenneth Burke is correct about us, it's what we all do. Human beings, he says, are rotten with perfection. Hawthorne's scientist is named Almer, and he cannot abide the slight imperfection that he discerns on his wife's lovely cheek, a tiny hand. He becomes progressively obsessed with eliminating the little birthmark. He mixes creams and potions and performs surgeries, and finally he is successful. But during the last operation, he kills his wife in the process of perfecting her. Marianne Long suffered from neurofibromatosis, elephant man's disease. One side of her face was smooth and regular. The other was twisted into a knot of nostrils and lips. As Flannery says, no one could mistake it for a charm. In Imelda, Richard Seltzer, a surgeon turned writer, tells another doctor-seeking perfection story, this time in a third world setting. Dr. Franciscus, a caring but paternalistic plastic surgeon, fixes the cleft lip of a young patient after she has died from anaphylactic shock during an allergic reaction to anesthesia. She did not want or need the operation, but he fulfills his need. In death, her face is now perfect. The doctors of Hawthorne and Seltzer have inadvertently killed their patients in the pursuit of perfection. At the climax of her essay, Flannery makes a connection between the abstract desire for ideal beauty and perfect health and a mode of killing that is not accidental, but intentional and widespread. Quote, "The Almers whom Hawthorne saw as a menace have multiplied. Busy cutting down human imperfection, they are making headway also on the raw material of good," unquote. She condemns this popular pity, as she calls it, what she provocatively names tenderness. A pleasant word, tenderness, with a warm and fuzzy valence. Yet she says that the logical outcome of tenderness, at least when wrapped in theory, is terror. It ends, she says, in forced labor camps and in the fumes of the gas chamber. For at least a decade, I have been teaching Flannery's essay to my literature and medicine students and asking them and myself what basis she might have for such an outrageous claim. As a result of the good work of Shelley Rubenfeld and Marcy Dallas, the curator of the exhibit, How Healing Becomes Killing, I think I better understand the direct connection that Flannery O'Connor discerned almost 50 years ago. Simply put, the connection is the human obsession with perfection. It is the need for perfection that drives us to our greatest achievements, but alas, as Burke says, we are rotten with it. The ordinary way of looking at human life is a dualistic battle between good against evil. We climb up the ladder of power and success, leaving weakness and failure behind. On the side of good, there is health, vitality, ability. On the side of evil, disease, dependence, disability. On the side of good, there is beauty, smooth, lovely, and gratifying. On the side of evil, ugliness, rough, irregular, disturbing. Evil is the enemy of good in this ordinary view and must be rooted out and eliminated, or at the least contained and confined so that good can prosper and flourish. Much of this series has directly or indirectly taken up the question of able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, and thus of disability and what Flannery tended to call affliction, a general term that included poverty as well as mental and physical disease and disability. Edwin Black asked us to consider the eugenics movement as a war against the weak. At the same time, we were asked to consider the current and potential benefits of assisted reproductive technology, the selection of embryos that are less likely to have birth defects, or birthmarks for that matter. Leon Kask asked us to consider the difference between thinking of children as products or thinking of them as strange gifts, as extensions of our own ambitions and agendas, or as creatures who make a claim on us simply by virtue of their presence, their personhood, their status as human beings. Flannery speaks of tenderness wrapped in theory. I think the theory that she may have in mind is the theory that mankind can be perfected, that affliction can be avoided, that disability can be eliminated. This myth of mastery is a faith in mankind's, or Germany's, or America's capacity to meet any challenge, solve any problem, cure any disease. It is the hope of the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, the confidence underlying the 19th century Industrial Revolution, the assumption of the 20th century scientific revolution, and the inspiration of our current information age, with James Watson's Human Genome Project as a shining example. According to Richard Gibbs, it has brought over $350 million to the city of Houston in recent years. It is the myth of mastery through progress, and it is as American as apple pie. Mastery and progress, of course, is what the Third Reich was all about. Eugenics, euthanasia, extermination, these practices were all undertaken in the name of progress and health. A commitment to progress alone is not enough, however, not enough to lead to a war against the weak. The engine of that war, at least according to Flannery O'Connor's cryptic claim, is tenderness. What does she mean by tenderness? I think it might be a version of pity, a word incidentally derived from the word piety. The kind of piety that Flannery warns us against is a pious faith in our conventional notions of progress and perfection, value and worth, health and beauty. It is a blind acceptance of our culture's wisdom, a sweet embrace of the dominant ideology. The greatest danger comes when a theory of mankind is motivated by a love of mankind not a participatory compassion, not the costly love of this or that afflicted person, but an abstract concern for those who we suspect would be better off dead. In Flannery's view, tenderness is a cheap, generalized sentimentality that leads to the disappearance of those whose unfit condition gives the lie to the myth that we are the masters of our fate, the captains of our souls. There are other ways of looking at that which is muddled, mottled, and messy. I commend to you Flannery's strange comic stories, peopled with characters that she unsentimentally calls, and I quote, cripples, freaks, and lunatics. They are her kinds of folks. Since we don't have time to read one of her stories tonight, I want to close with a poem by one of her favorite writers, the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, famous for his broken forms and a prosody he called sprung rhythm, poetic techniques that imitate, one might say, the imperfections of human bodies and minds. Hopkins is famous for an odd sonnet praising not the smooth beauty that we think of as classic, but what he called pied beauty. Pied, incidentally, while close in sound to pity and piety, springs from a completely different root. It means splotchy, patchy in color, piebald, like a pie bird, a magpie. While most of Hopkins's images are drawn from nature, I think it is useful to read this poem as a tribute to everything dappled in creation, including those who are splotchy with disabilities. And if you'll allow me, I'll read the poem twice. Pied Beauty by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finch's wings, landscape, pieced, plotted, and plowed, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift slow, sweet sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finch's wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift slow, sweet sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Our next speaker, our second speaker, is Jacquie Brennan, an attorney who has devoted her professional career to disability law issues. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, her interest in disability issues started with her 9 children, including her 5 youngest, who are all adopted and have various disabilities. Ms. Brennan has served the disability community in private practice as the managing attorney for Advocacy Incorporated, Texas Protection Advocacy Agency, and now with the Southwest ADA Center, a program of ILRU, Independent Living Research Utilization, at Memorial Hermann TIRR. She also told me tonight that she sues doctors, horror of horrors, but we're letting her speak anyway. Ms. Brennan serves on the board of directors of WomenAid of Houston and is the vice president of the board of directors for Project DOCC of Houston. That is the Project for the Delivery of Chronic Care. She is also the director of the Center for Paralegal Studies at the University of Houston. Ms. Brennan will speak about the ways in which, in legal terms, we define disability by going through a brief history of disability eugenics that focuses on the United States and the kinds of disability eugenics that still exist in our society. Please welcome Ms. Jacquie Brennan.
Thanks, Shelley, and thanks for letting me talk anyway. I'm an attorney, as he mentioned, and my primary interest and area of practice is always been disability law. It sounds like a really narrow area of the law, but it really isn't, and part of why it isn't is because there's not just one definition of disability. Disability, in fact, doesn't even have a medically based definition, in spite of the fact that physicians are often called upon to make determinations about disability and to even sometimes assign a percentage of how much of a disability a person has. It really is a legal term of art and not a medical one. And to complicate matters further, there are multiple definitions of disability. We have different definitions for disability depending on what law you're talking about. If you're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act or the Fair Housing Act or the Air Carrier Access Act or workers' compensation laws that are different in every single state, or Social Security law, the Vocational Rehab Act. So we have lots of definitions of disability out there, which makes defining it as one thing even more complicated. But disability law didn't start in this country, of course, and neither did disability eugenics, even though it flourished here. And I want to go through this PowerPoint presentation with you that I hope will provide some context. I want to start off by saying that language is a very important thing to us all, but especially to people in the disability community, where we really emphasize using people-first language. So it isn't a person who is epileptic or diabetic, but a person who has epilepsy or has diabetes. But this presentation deals with history, and so there are lots of outdated and just incorrect terms that are used, but they're historical references, and I left them in for this presentation for the historical accuracy of that. This presentation focuses on disability eugenics in the United States, but we'll start long before that, and just to provide some context for that. But once the eugenics movement takes hold in America, then this presentation will really focus on this country and what happened here. In Sparta, in 800 BC, the state took a role in determining which weak children would be raised and which would be left to die of exposure. And most historians believe that there were actually councils in the city that would decide this. Children would be brought, and the council would decide whether they should be left to die of exposure or whether they should be raised. In 449 BC, there's an early legal reference to people with cognitive disabilities found in the 12 Tables of Rome that says, if a person is a fool, let his person and his goods be under the protection of his family or his paternal relatives if he's not under the care of anyone. It references a form of guardianship that would be provided by the family. In 360 BC, in Plato's Republic, society is improved by selective breeding, which Plato says is beneficial to society because it produces ideal citizens. In 1601, under Queen Elizabeth I, we had Elizabethan poor laws to aid the deserving poor, orphaned, and crippled. The 1601 law laid some of the burden on society by charging a poor rate on property owners. And Queen Elizabeth's government divided the poor into 3 groups, and the disabled poor were placed in the group labeled helpless poor, and they received a sum of money or food each month, which was sort of a precursor to SSI and SSDI that we have today. In the colonies here, before what actually was the United States, the acts and laws of His Majesty's English colony of Connecticut in New England in America provided an act for relieving and ordering of idiots, impotent, distracted, and idle persons. Show of hands, how many people fall into one of those? Never mind. This act stated that those considered idiots, impotent, distracted, and idle persons should be cared for by their closest relative, and if such a person had no relative, then the town or the colony itself took direct responsibility. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk and published studies about his work with peas that later became really the foundation for what would become modern genetics later. There was a study published about a family called the Jukes, and it was called A Study in Crime, Pauperism, Disease, and Heredity. And it emphasized the defects in this family line and the cost to society for allowing these traits to be passed on. The New York State Asylum for Feeble-Minded Women of Childbearing Age opened in 1878 in Newark, New York as an experimental facility for these inherently promiscuous women and their crime-prone offspring. Sir Francis Galton actually coined the term eugenics in 1885. He advocated restrictions on the breeding of the feeble-minded. He believed intelligence varied by race, and quite naturally, looking at his picture, you can guess which race he thought was the most intelligent, Caucasians, and sadly, he had no children, so his superior bloodline ended with him. In the mid to late 1800s, there were also advocates who sought to bring some dignity to the care of individuals with disabilities. People like Dorothea Dix, Josephine Shaw Lowell, William Letchworth all advocated for better treatment for people with disabilities. In 1907, the first compulsory sterilization law was passed in Indiana. Even before the law was passed, illegal sterilizations were performed at the Indiana State Reformatory. People who were confined to state institutions were subjected to this procedure, and several other states followed Indiana's lead by implementing forced sterilization laws. California followed just 2 years later. It was the second state to pass compulsory sterilization laws, and it was a very severely strict law in that it included not only the feeble-minded in state institutions, but also prisoners who were convicted of 3 or more crimes. So we think the 3 strikes and you're outlaw is bad. Here, 3 crimes and you're sterilized. Prisoners displaying sexuality, although that's not defined in the law, they actually said that those people were also covered. And later, any person who was in an insane asylum. All of these categories were to be forcibly sterilized. In 1910, the first eugenics record office was opened by Charles Davenport, who was a biologist and eugenicist, and he created this eugenics record office at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. He studied hereditary traits through several generations, and he thought it was possible to predict inherited traits mathematically. In 1911, the Better Baby contest was held at the Ohio State Fair. It had actually started before that in Louisiana, but soon spread to the Midwest. And wherever they had state fairs where they judged livestock, they also started judging babies, literally next to the livestock, and on the same sorts of traits like health, intellectual development, and physical development, and of course, they had to be free from defects. And in my research, they were 100% Caucasian babies as well. In 1912, the first International Congress of Eugenics was held at the University of London and was attended by many eugenicists and scientists, including Alexander Graham Bell and Winston Churchill. Discussions included eugenics laws, heredity, enforced sterilization, and segregation of the unfit. In 1914, Grant Haig published The Eugenic Marriage, a personal guide to the new science of better living and better babies, which encouraged you to find your mate based on their qualities that they could bring to your babies. In 1917, there was a movie called The Black Stork that urged parents to refrain from treatment or surgery for newborn disabled babies, even those whose lives could be saved with surgery. Sort of a survival of the fittest theme on that. And then there was, as a natural consequence of the Better Baby contest, we had the Fitter Family contest. And it was held, presented by Arthur Capper for Excellent Eugenics Showing Grade A Kansas Free Fair. And this contest celebrates a goodly heritage of well-bred families free of defects. So you had to show your family tree and with as many pictures as possible and swear that you had no defective people in your family. And that was also held at state fairs, just like the Better Baby contest. The American Eugenics Society in 1925 changed its name, big radical change from the Eugenics Society of America to the American Eugenics Society. And they continued to promote eugenics and sought to prevent the births of defective infants. In 1927, probably the sort of the centerpiece of the eugenics movement, Buck versus Bell, which was a Supreme Court case that upheld the sterilization of what they called defectives. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion for the 8-1 decision that legitimized Virginia's law on sterilization, and that law was not repealed until 1974. The case legalized eugenic sterilization laws throughout the United States. It involved an 18-year-old woman named Carrie Buck who lived in the Virginia State Colony for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptics. That's right, at that time, people with epilepsy were lumped in with the class called feeble-minded. The court said that she was feeble-minded, as was her mother, and that she had given birth to a child who also appeared to be feeble-minded. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The argument against forced sterilization, beyond the basic human rights argument, was that it violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and so it was unconstitutional. Holmes' opinion is really a little sickening to read at this point, but it speaks of forced sterilization as being for the welfare of society when carried out on mental defectives. It also says that sterilization in females and vasectomies in males can be carried out without affecting pain. Pretty sure he never had a vasectomy. It goes on to say that sterilization is in the best interest of society because these mental defectives, if released, might be a menace to society, but if incapable of procreating, might be released and live productive lives. It also opines that insanity is hereditary, so presumably we could eradicate it by sterilizing all the insane people, and that worked out really well. The court said that forced sterilization will save society from dealing with socially inadequate offspring and will prevent society from being swamped with incompetence. And probably my favorite sentence from the whole opinion, the same principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes. That's actually in the Supreme Court opinion. Between 1907 and 1960, nearly 100,000 individuals with disabilities or those who were deemed to have disabilities were legally forcibly sterilized in the United States. In 1934, there was a movie called Tomorrow's Children about sterilization laws, and the heroine is from a poor family that includes drunkards, jailbirds, cripples, and the deranged. And in order to get welfare for life, the family must agree to get sterilized. After a dramatic confession that she's not really a biological member of this family, the heroine is spared from the surgery. You can't get it on Netflix, I looked. what America was told, the eugenics movement in the US was not some fringe group with an unpopular cause. It was supported by state governments and the federal governments. And the message was, we can rid society of poverty, crime, and disease if we just stop these people from reproducing. Hundreds of thousands of American children were warehoused as feeble-minded and morons in nearly every state, starting in the early 1900s, and the federal government did nothing to stop this practice in the states. The children were told they would be there for life. Many of these warehouses did not close until the 1960s. When they were released, many of the adults discovered that they actually were of average intelligence. 30 years later, it was discovered that many scientific experiments had been performed on these children without their knowledge or consent. In one case, scientists from MIT gave radioactive oatmeal and milk to the children as part of a study for Quaker oats. Because of the lack of consent, these experiments violated the Nuremberg Code, which had been established 10 years earlier. And in 1996, the survivors were compensated by the government and by Quaker Oats and MIT, as a matter of fact. Eugenics, which had been taken, of course, to extremes in Nazi Germany, fell into disrepute. But actually, it was more the word eugenics that fell into disrepute, but the practice just started finding new words and new outlets. In 1974, federal judge Gerhard Gesell estimated that over the last few years, between 100,000 and 150,000 low-income persons were sterilized under federally funded programs. Ruling for the plaintiffs in this class action lawsuit, Gesell stated that an indefinite number of those sterilized were improperly coerced into accepting sterilization. He said that the dividing line between family planning and eugenics was murky. In 1975, the New York Times reported that doctors in major cities were routinely performing hysterectomies on mostly Black welfare recipients as a form of sterilization, a practice that came to be known euphemistically among medical insiders as the Mississippi appendectomy. In 1978, the first test tube baby was born in England. The Repository for Germinal Choice, which was also known as the Nobel Prize winner Sperm Bank, was opened in 1980, and their mission was to increase the intellect of children in the United States. It selected sperm donors on the basis of scientific achievement and publication, as well as artistic abilities and health, and it closed in 1999. Norplant was approved as a birth control device which was implanted under the skin and would last for about 5 years. And it provided an alternative to permanent sterilization for women by preventing their pregnancies for 5 years. A popular proposal was to reduce the birth rate among welfare recipients by threatening the loss of benefits unless they had the Norplant surgically implanted in their arms. In 1991, Kansas Representative Carrie Patrick defended a proposal to offer $500 to any welfare mother who accepted Norplant, saying that the program has the potential to save taxpayers millions of their hard-earned dollars. In 1997, Dolly the sheep was cloned. In 2001, the Virginia state legislature expressed profound regret for its role in the eugenics movement. Virginia was the state from which the Buck versus Bell case came. In 2002, in Atkins versus Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional to execute a person who has mental retardation who has been convicted of murder. And the reasoning was based on the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of the use of cruel and unusual punishment. Do we as a society still sanction disability eugenics today in the United States? We do. It's tempting to believe that eugenics is something that we as a society just can look back on and condemn, but it still exists in this country, and it's still legally and socially sanctioned in at least one very important way. The vast majority of prenatal testing is done to determine whether a baby will have a disability so that the parents can make a decision about terminating the pregnancy. Parents who get this bad news more often than not do choose to terminate the pregnancy, and as a society, we by and large support these choices. Within the disability community, such choices are sometimes viewed as an opinion that the world would be a better place without people with disabilities. I would rather that my child be dead than to be like you. In an opinion poll that was conducted nationally in 2006, 70% of Americans believe that a woman should be able to obtain a legal abortion if there's a strong chance the baby will have what the poll called a serious defect. I do want to be clear that I do support a woman's right to reproductive choice, but I'm uncomfortable with the inclination that we use disability as the sole reason for that choice. Prenatal testing is now logically considered a good part of good prenatal care because its goal is to help parents have healthy babies. And many in the disability community, however, believe that medical research and advances should be geared toward improving the lives of people with disabilities, not preventing the lives of people with disabilities. In a way, prenatal tests actually reinforce disability discrimination and misconceptions. The future of disability eugenics is certain in that it will continue to exist. What's less certain is how the law will deal with it. Medicine and technology are moving way faster than the laws that deal with those issues. One interesting possibility in the future is that a child with a disability might have an action in tort. For a tort claim, you just have to make the case that a person owed you a duty, they breached that duty, the duty was the cause of the damages that you suffered. And in a scenario such as a sort of quasi-wrongful life claim, a person with a disability who is born with something that could have been picked up in prenatal testing, say spina bifida, could, as an adult, perhaps have a cause of action against their parents for this sort of wrongful life, that you owed me a duty, you breached the duty by not having testing, which could have saved me from this life that I had to lead, where there was a great deal of pain and a great deal of suffering, and you didn't cause the disability, but your choice caused me to live with this disability. There'll also be suits that may come out of the fact that we may be able to do gene replacement at some point in the not too distant future when we find a defect in an infant, so in utero. So lots of legal questions about what we'll do. And it's also important to remember that about 80% of people with disabilities were not born with a disability, but acquired the disability later. There are unique medical, legal, and ethical challenges that lie ahead in this really ever-changing field of disability and eugenics. And we have to meet those challenges with ways in which we can celebrate our differences, educate society, respect choices, and improve lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. Our third speaker tonight is Richard Petty, Program Director at ILRU, the Independent Living Research Utilization and Program of Memorial Hermann TIRR, which I didn't mention before is the Institute for Rehabilitation and Research. Since 1988, he has directed the ILNET, that's I-L-N-E-T, a national project that provides training and technical assistance to Centers for Independent Living and statewide independent living councils, organizations which foster community independence for people with disabilities. He also directs other national training and technical assistance projects at ILRU and is conducting research on the experience of those with disabilities affected by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Before coming to ILRU, Mr. Petty served for 10 years as Executive Director of Mainstream, an advocacy-oriented center for independent living in Little Rock, Arkansas. He holds an MBA degree from the C.T. Bauer School of Business at the University of Houston and is currently a student in the Human and Organizational Systems doctoral program of Fielding University. Mr. Petty will present a historical perspective on the effects of eugenics and Darwinism on society's treatment of people with disability in the United States and Germany between 1933 and 1945, and an overview of contemporary societal perceptions of people with disabilities. Please welcome Mr. Richard Petty.
My presentation is going to be a little bit different from advertised because Jacquie has done such a fine job of covering the historical background of eugenics. And I believe that our time could be very well spent to come forward well more than half a century and talk some about the debate that now goes on between disability rights advocates like those of the group Not Dead Yet and people like Princeton philosopher Peter Singer, who holds that children with disabilities should be killed if they are children with disabilities and would experience a life of suffering, and in fact that adults with severe cognitive disabilities should also be killed. I'm going to shorten my remarks a little bit in hopes that we can have some additional time to engage in discussion after the presentations. I'll also be glad to answer questions about any points that I'm not covering that I had promised to cover. But let's begin with some context. I don't think there's much that I can share with you about the Holocaust that you and people with disabilities that you won't experience as you go through the exhibit here. But what I can do is provide some context and perhaps begin to draw some unfortunate parallels between the circumstances that existed in Nazi Germany at the time of the Holocaust and some of the perspectives that are held even now by, in some cases, medical professionals and the larger society. For a vignette of Nazi Germany, let's begin in the fall of 1938. In Leipzig, Germany, a child was born to the Nauer family. And it was not a happy occasion for the family. The child was born with multiple disabilities. The father took the child to the Leipzig University Children's Clinic, asking that the physicians there kill the child. The physicians declined, saying that that would be against the laws of Germany. Well, the father then petitioned directly to Adolf Hitler to allow the physicians to kill the child. Hitler dispatched his own personal physician, Karl Brandt, to Leipzig. And there, upon verifying the accuracy of the statements that were made by the father about his child, the child did have multiple disabilities, Dr. Brandt authorized the physicians at the Leipzig Children's Clinic to kill the child. In authorizing Brandt's direction to the physicians, Hitler made it clear that he wanted Brandt to indicate to the parents that they were in no way responsible for the decision to kill the child, that in fact it was a decision of the state. Although I doubt that Adolf Hitler was capable of showing mercy or kindness, I think it's interesting that he did in some way, out of the prejudice that existed at that point, see the need to try to comfort the parents for the killing of their child. This set the stage for the later killing of tens of thousands of children, beginning in 1939 and continuing till 1941. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of adults were killed in programs of euthanasia, and hundreds of thousands more were sterilized. The children were identified by physicians and their communities and by nurses who were paid for identifying them. They were taken to the facilities, and experts in those facilities then made the judgment about whether or not those children should live or die. In almost all cases, the decision was death. And these children with disabilities were placed in hunger houses or hunger pavilions where they were left to die slowly through starvation. Some were killed with lethal injections. Adults with disabilities were shipped to one of 6 facilities where they were gassed and their bodies were burned. Protests from the church and some citizens caused the regime to decide to end the organized, systematic program of killing in 1941. But after that time, an unorganized program of what was called wild euthanasia began. And in that program, institutions and physicians were left to their own devices to go out into the countryside and find people with disabilities and bring them in and kill them. Unofficial, but equally as deadly for a large number of people. And of course, hundreds of thousands of people in concentration camps were killed because they were too disabled to work. And as I mentioned earlier, hundreds of thousands of people were sterilized. They were sterilized because they were deaf, because they had other congenital disabilities, and all of that was tied to the eugenics that Jacquie has talked about, the desire to save the race from the impurity and the danger that people with disabilities pose to the race. Sometimes disguised as kindness, sometimes disguised as betterment for the entire population of Germany. Well, let's come forward now more than half a century to 2003. And perhaps there's some parallels here that we can tease out. At that point, this is probably one of the best examples of the debate that is ongoing between disability rights activists like the group Not Dead Yet and the Princeton philosopher Peter Singer, who holds that parents should have the option of killing their children who may have a life of disability, of unpleasantness, of suffering. He believes that parents should have that option. And indeed, he believes that some adults with cognitive disabilities who are so severely disabled that they no longer are people, in his words, that they should also be killed. His views are not alone, but they're illustrative of some of the issues that people are certainly thinking about, were thinking about in 2003 and continue to think about. Not Dead Yet is an activist organization of people with disabilities. They're founded in the Midwest, and they are one of the most radical disability rights organizations, and they come forward with an agenda that no decision about us as people with disabilities should be made without us, and that the decisions about life and death that are often made about people with disabilities are based on the prejudices of those who are making the decisions, and that indeed the wrong people are making the decisions about those decisions of life and death, that the decisions should be made by those people with disabilities. It's an interesting story how disability rights lawyer and activist Harriet Johnson met and came to know Peter Singer. Singer had come to the College of Charleston in her hometown, that's in Charleston, South Carolina, and made a presentation on his views. Johnson came there representing Not Dead Yet, and in the question and answer period, she made several challenges to Singer's assertions. From that, they began a correspondence when Singer returned to Princeton. And after some time, Singer asked her to come to Princeton and debate him. She found Singer cordial, interesting, pleasant, but she also saw herself as being drawn into a debate, probably a very civil debate, about whether or not she had the right to exist. So you can imagine that she approached that concept of having a debate with this person with some trepidation. She thought that giving someone like Peter Singer another forum, another opportunity to advance his views was something that she might not ought to do. But finally, she decided that, in fact, it would be worthwhile if she went and learned more about him, about his views, so that she and other disability rights activists could better counter them. And I have to add that she also said that she thought about the fact that when she came back to Charleston, that she probably would have wonderful stories to tell to her family and friends. And I think, as Dr. Monroe might attest, many of us who are Southerners are fascinated with being able to tell stories and certainly appreciate irony, as did Flannery O'Connor. And I guess that coming from the Deep South, as Harriet does, she certainly probably appreciates the irony of where she was and what she was doing. I need to tell you a little bit about her so that you can understand the context of her situation. And what I tell you comes from her writing about herself. She is a person who experiences a severe muscle wasting disease. She describes herself as being a bag of bones and loose skin. She has spinal curvature that causes her to lean far to one side in her wheelchair. People in Charleston who see this successful civil rights attorney zooming around in her wheelchair will stop her. They'll pat her head. They'll say, "God bless you. I pray for you. I don't know how you can do what you do. I couldn't do what you do. I'd have to kill myself." Well, this is the person that Peter Singer sees, described in her own words. This is the person that Peter Singer sees, and this is the person that Peter Singer debated. Singer himself comes from Australia. He's an avid animal activist, animal rights activist, and speaking of irony and paradoxes, it certainly seems an irony to many of us that he seems to have considerable respect for animal life and very little respect for human life, at least as far as people with disabilities are concerned. As I mentioned earlier, Harriet said, I felt like I was drawn into a very civil debate about whether or not I had the right to exist. Singer says that parents should have the option of killing a child that would experience suffering in its life. Parents want healthy children. And why shouldn't they have the option of replacing an unhealthy child with a healthy child? It's as if, for him, children are fungible, that they can be replaced like a commodity, like natural gas. You simply substitute one child for another. Not only does Johnson argue for the uniqueness of individuals, regardless of their lives, but she also suggests that it's wrong to make life and death considerations based on market forces, the market of healthy babies, when that market is structured on intolerance and discrimination. Singer also believes that adults with severe cognitive disabilities should be killed if they no longer are what he describes as being persons. Johnson counters that indeed there is beauty and value in all life, and that the support that caregivers provide to people in those circumstances can be beautiful and rewarding in and of itself. I believe that Lex in a minute may talk about some perspectives within the disability community that there are about assisted suicide. Our late friend Drew Batavia has written about the fact that if we as people with disabilities cannot physically take our own lives, we should have assistance in doing so. We should have choice. Johnson would argue that, in fact, that's differential treatment. Because don't we do many things to try to keep most people from committing suicide? Therapy, we have counseling, we have support. But it seems that for us, and here I would add medical professionals are in that group and our society in general, it seems at least many of us in that larger society, I'm not among them, but many feel that it makes perfect sense that a life not worth living is something we should facilitate the end of. We should facilitate the end of life. So the contrast is we try for anyone else to keep them from killing themselves. Well, that's something that is of great concern. The other concerns are who's making those decisions, who's counseling, who's supporting that decision process. And Johnson argues that it should be people with disabilities if it occurs at all. Johnson says that in a just society, we would not even be having this debate. And finally, she talks about quality of life. And there are those who are making decisions about quality of life about people with disabilities when indeed she says that quality of life is not affected one way or the other by disability. That life with disability can be rich and can be anything that the person wants it to be as a person with a disability. Certainly, Johnson pushes the envelope for us, as do our good friends at Not Dead Yet. For many of us, there are nuances there that may not be acknowledged, but on the other hand, there's a fundamental truth in that argument that is certainly worth discussing and worth considering. And finally, in closing, I think that it's important to acknowledge that some of those perhaps ill-considered kindnesses or solicitude that occurred in the Third Reich were the same kinds of thinking that supported what later became the mass murder of children and adults. No, we don't have an organized system of killing that they did in the Third Reich, but evermore we are coming to face very difficult decisions. And we may not be ending the lives of children after their birth, but we certainly are, as Jacquie alluded, we are facing decisions of life about whether or not to abort children. We are facing decisions about how we will We will look at the genetics of unborn children and the actions that we'll take. And so, indeed, we're closer than we might think to what did occur and closer than we think to what could occur. We have some difficult decisions to make and some important discussions to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Well, we'll continue our discussion with our final distinguished panelist and organizer of tonight's panel, Professor Lex Frieden, who is credited with defining and pioneering the concept of independent living in the mid-1970s. Professor Frieden was instrumental in conceiving and drafting the 1990 American with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and has received 2 presidential citations for his work in the field of disability. He has served as Executive Director and Chairperson of the National Council on Disability, President of Rehabilitation International, and Chairperson of the American Association of People with Disabilities. At present, he is Professor of Health Informatics and of Physical Medicine Rehabilitation at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, Professor of Physical Medicine Rehabilitation and of Community and Family Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, Senior Vice President of Memorial Hermann TIRR Hospital, and Director of the ILRU Research, Training, and Technical Assistance Program on Independent Living at TIRR. In 1988, he received the Henry B. Betts Award for efforts that significantly improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. Professor Frieden will talk about recent themes emerging from the public discussion of right to life, right to die, end-of-life planning, and advanced care planning. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Lex Frieden.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Shelley, for having us. I'd like to thank the members of the panel for joining me here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for staying with us to hear our various views on some very important and timely topics. You've heard a bit about history, you've heard about a bit about recent themes, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, among other things, tonight. First of all, I need to acknowledge the surgeon in Oklahoma City who is responsible largely for my being here tonight. On November the 20th, 1967, I was involved in a car accident along with 10 other students in Stillwater, Oklahoma. My neck was broken in the accident. I didn't know it at the time, but after being diagnosed with a spinal cord injury, I was sent to an emergency department in a hospital in Oklahoma City. I was met there by a neurosurgeon and his team and by my parents who had driven to the city from our home in northwestern Oklahoma. And I recall being there, I never lost consciousness. Having the clothes torn off me, and I really, really didn't like that because I had on one of my favorite shirts that night, and they literally cut it to shreds with scissors. You know, the funny little things you remember during that kind of a circumstance. I also remember the physician, the surgeon, asking my mother, "Do you want us to keep him alive?" My mother said, "What?" The surgeon said, "To keep him alive, we're going to have to exercise some very aggressive treatment. If we don't, he will surely die." My mother said, "Why would you ask me that question?" Well, the surgeon said, he was severely, seriously injured. His neck was broken. There's a great likelihood that he will never be able to walk again. He may not even be able to get out of bed again. You have to understand the serious nature of this injury. My mother said, "Will he be able to do anything? Will he be able to think? Act? Act on his thoughts? Talk? What will he be able to do?" The surgeon said, "I can't tell you what he might be able to do. I can't tell you how much he might recover. All I can tell you is that he is in a very serious condition, and the outcome, regardless of what we do, may not be very good. My mother said, "Will he be a vegetable?" The surgeon said, "I don't think so." My mother said, "Do everything you can." My father was back there shaking his head, yes. "Do everything you can to help him." And that's why I'm here today, because that team in Oklahoma City did everything they could do to ensure that I survived. And since then, a lot of good healthcare providers, largely, by the way, at TIRR, where I happen to work today. I came here for rehabilitation in 1968 and spent 3 wonderful months there in the Institute, enjoying the Houston humidity. And, I was eager to move back. So, we all have things to be grateful for. And I guess being thankful, depends on your perspective. It never occurred to me to be angry because that surgeon saved my life. It never occurred to me to be angry because my mother said, "Do everything you can for him." It never occurred to me to be angry because circumstances befell me that I wish they hadn't. What occurred to me was a lot of people have done a lot of things to make sure I had a life. And I have to do everything I can to oblige them by doing everything I can. And, I think we really have to deal with disability from an attitudinal standpoint. Now, unfortunately, not everybody has the same attitude as I do about disability. And I'm not suggesting that they should by any means, but I do believe that healthcare providers in particular must be careful, very careful, about making judgments regarding other people's lives based on their own personal experiences and values and prejudices. Now I have a slide here that a lady in Phoenix, Arizona put up on the side of the road. She painted a bus and she says, "Disability is an equal opportunity club you can join at any time." In fact, if you are 30 years of age or older now, the odds of your being disabled at least 6 months during your life before you're age 65 are 1 in 2. So a little more data. Our society is aging at a very rapid rate. We're on the edge of the baby boom bubble, and it's about to burst. In January the 1st, 2010, 10,000 people will reach retirement age. January the 2nd, 10,000 more. 10,000 more on the 3rd, and on and on and on until the year 2020, when they're based on current data and projections, are apt to be 80 million people with disabilities in the United States, about half of whom are over the age of 65. Now, it is my thesis that we're not going to get rid of all these people. Okay? I dare you to come for me. It's just not going to happen. So the question is, how are we going to care for these people? Because by definition, people with disabilities may be able in some respects, but they have needs in other respects. And this is one of the issues that's driving organizations like Not Dead Yet to protest issues like advanced care planning, assisted suicide, and so on. Some people with disabilities would say, what could be worse than the life I'm living? Now, at the bottom of my slides, and you can go to the next slide, Jackie. Oh, by the way, this is, I put this in for my geneticist friends in the audience. James Watson is, a very famous person who contributed to science in some radical ways. I mean, he defined genetics, I would say, and he said you would have to be crazy to say you wanted one because that child has no future. Speaking of a child with Down syndrome. He, by the way, according to a British broadcast producer happens to have an adult child who is intellectually disabled. So it's hard to imagine a person assuming those kinds of views. But nonetheless, I guess we all have a right to our opinions. Next. Richard mentioned Harriet McBride Johnson, who really wonders sometimes, and I think many people with disabilities share the feeling, should I in fact be alive? And I think we have to be concerned about our parents, our grandparents, and ourselves as we age, about how we might feel in a society in the future where the objective is to make sure people with disabilities aren't born. Next slide. Think about this future. Disabled children who escape the net of screening will be born into a new form of bastardy and prejudice. This was written last week in the Washington Post by Michael Gerson. And it is a possible future when you think about what we have the technology to do today and the choices to make in the future. But I don't think any of us are going to want to compromise our quality of life simply because we're getting older and because by nature we are becoming disabled. I don't think so. What do we do instead of that? We build a society that accommodates people with disabilities. We took a step forward with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we have a long way to go. People with disabilities who say now today, my life can't get any worse. Help me find someone to assist with suicide. Those people are not able to make any rational choices because there are no choices for them in the community. We do not have an infrastructure of care in the community. In order to get care now, many people have to go to specialists. They have to go to clinics. They have to be treated in elaborate protocols. There is no community-based system of care. You cannot get a personal assistant on call if you need one in the city of Houston today. It won't happen. Try to aid one of your grandparents, your parent, or somebody else who needs some assistance on a moment's notice. You're just not going to be able to find that kind of assistance because we have yet to develop the kind of infrastructure we need in our society. That's what we need to work on. Many people with disabilities are going to be here regardless of what we do. Next slide. Christopher and Carney, two good bioethicists from Kansas City, have said Americans have reached consensus that people have a right to refuse life-sustaining medical interventions, and interventions can be terminated, including artificial nutrition and hydration. That's true. The problem, they say, is the unresolved issue of how to decide for mentally incompetent patients. This is interesting. They use the word incompetence. That's a legal term. It's very difficult for a hospital or a doctor to get a judgment made by a court about the competence of a person who happens to be a patient in the hospital. On the other hand, they are asked to make judgments about capacity. Capacity is a judgment that can be made by any physician at any time and other healthcare providers as well. Some people seeing me in a hospital bed might say my capacity is so limited that a judgment would have to be made on my behalf. And in the state of Texas, they might call a proxy to make a decision. If I was divorced from my wife, but she was still living and in the neighborhood, whether she liked me or not, they might call her and ask her to serve as a proxy, legally doing so. And if she didn't like me, she might say, let's end it all right now, happily, and go on her way. This is not the way, we want logic to work on matters of life and death, but it is in practice the way it does work, and that is what leads to concern by many of us, people with disabilities, who feel like we need to clarify for providers of health care and social services in particular, decision-making as it relates to people with disabilities. Data suggests that even people with the most severe mental retardation can make appropriate judgments when it comes to their own care and life. Several studies which prove that. There are questions about other types of disabilities, but too often people with only physical disabilities are judged to be incapacitated because I look like every other one of them. What does that mean? It means that there is prejudice. It means that there are categories that are made about people with disabilities and assumptions that are made every day, and particularly in healthcare, because most people with disabilities are poor. Most people with disabilities are on the lower end of the socioeconomic status. And because of that, while I'm not, if I go into a certain hospital and I'm not able to communicate my own wishes, the assumption will be made that I'm just like every other one. And therefore, there aren't enough resources around to sustain my life and support me for an extended period of time, which might be required. Therefore, life-sustaining treatment may in fact end. Next slide. Go. Okay. 3 years ago, there was a great movement in this country called end-of-life planning. There was millions and millions of dollars put into this effort by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and other foundations to help encourage people to avoid the situation, the Terry Chavo case, where a person may actually not be able to communicate their wishes, but might have made a communication of wishes had they had the opportunity to do so before they were in a compromised situation. Because of the protest of disability groups, this so-called voluntary euthanasia is now called advance directives. So you can go into any healthcare provider and ask to have an advance directive. People with disabilities, many of us still see that as, quote, end-of-life planning. And nobody's able to assist us with that planning because, quite frankly, we don't know enough to appropriately counsel people on how their lives might end if they have a compromising circumstance. Next slide. Well, that's the car I was in when I got my neck broken. There are patients in the hospitals here in Houston and all over the world today who are in compromised positions because they happen to be in an accident, or they happen to get a disease, or they happen to come in contact with somebody who transmitted a disease to them, and they're in a compromised situation, and there are teams of physicians, social workers, nurses, chaplains, and family members who are deciding what their fate might be. How should that decision be made? Well, perhaps it can be informed by appropriate advanced care planning. And I would say that it's a good thing to have counselors available to people, but not in the last waning hours of their life. Please try to find a mechanism to help people do this planning, not when they're in the hospital near death, but to do it when they're perfectly capable of assessing the options at a point in time in life where they can understand possibilities, not at a compromised situation. And unfortunately, that's the most frequent time people are called upon to make these decisions, not only individuals themselves, but also family members and other proxies. This statement stands on its own. More people with disabilities will die through decisions to forgo treatments than through assisted suicide. Next one. This is important. The burden of disease and care is a legitimate consideration by patients thinking about discontinuing treatment, but it's not a reason for surrogates or providers to devalue those lives. The judgment about the value of an individual's life must be made by the individual themselves. To the extent that healthcare providers feel compelled to make a judgment on behalf of someone else, they should stop and think and understand very clearly that their decision is being informed by their own experience, not by the experience of the person about whom they're making a judgment. So be very, very, very careful when you're called upon to make those kinds of judgments, as you must be from time to time in your profession. Next slide.
That is the next slide.
That's the last slide. No. Clearly, we have more machines than we know what to do with in the hospital today. Machines can keep people alive forever, virtually. Many people will be kept alive after the point in time in which they can fully appreciate it. I urge every one of you to find a counselor and talk about advanced care planning. Do it in a conscious, open way with your family members, with your friends, with your colleagues. Do it with people who can advise you appropriately, and do it in such a manner that you have choices to make along the way. I have recently talked to a friend who's alive because a local physician in one of our fine hospitals here made the decision, nearly arbitrarily, I think he got a little help, to suspend reference to an advanced care directive long enough to provide a person with some artificial life-saving techniques that probably would have been not applied had the advanced care directive been strictly followed. My friend now says that she wishes she had been thoughtful enough to consider that medical professionals might, given today's technology, necessarily need, in order to extend life with good purpose and with good quality, to use some of these very, very advanced measures. Respirators now are used not only to extend a person's life without the ability to breathe on their own, sometimes they're used now to help a person breathe with assistive technology long enough to regain enough energy to do so on their own. And we can give you example after that. So as you do engage in your own advanced care planning, consider the impact of modern technology and make provisions for using that technology in an effective way. I'd like to conclude my remarks now simply by saying, again, if you are in the situation where you are necessarily called upon to make a judgment for me or for anybody else with a disability, think twice about doing so based strictly on your own experience, your own values, and your own culture. Because I believe that those of us with disabilities share a certain culture that is defined not by what we can't do, but by what we can do. Not by what we can't enjoy, but by what we do enjoy. It's been my pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you.